Thunder rolled over Drywater as a gunshot shattered the night. Dust leapt from the street like a waking beast. Jonah Reed stood in the open, coat flapping, eyes set on the jailhouse. Sheriff Malachi Boone waited in the doorway, badge catching lightning. Jonah said, "I am done running." Boone said, "Then stand still." Lantern glass tinkled across the boards. Eli Carter hissed from the shadows to keep low. Jonah said, "If I kneel, I stay buried." Boone said, "You were buried the day you came here." A balcony creaked, and Lila Marlowe watched with a guarded gaze. Hank Hollis leaned on a post, silent as a headstone. Jonah raised his hands, but not in surrender. Boone smiled like a trap closing. The street swallowed its echo as Jonah slipped into the livery. The smell of hay and iron wrapped the dark like rope. Eli rose from the shadows with grit on his cheek. Eli said, "You should have shot." Jonah said, "He wants that story told." A distant bell clanged cold as a chain. "You man." Jonah checked his revolver and found his hand shaking. He closed it into a fist until the tremor quit. Eli said, "Boone owns the town." Jonah said, "He does not own the truth." A mare stamped and rattled her bridle. Jonah said, "Tomorrow, I pull the first nail." Eli said, "Then we better bring a hammer." Outside, the rain turned mean. Dawn bled over the mesa as Hank met them behind the church. The cross leaned like a tired man. Hank said, "You came back to a noose woven from whispers." Jonah said, "I came back for a name." Hank's gaze weighed the years between them. Eli watched, hungry for answers, and afraid of them. Hank said, "Boone traded favors for fear, and fear never misses a meal." Jonah said, "He framed me with a ledger I never saw." Hank looked toward town, where smoke climbed like a lie. "Hank," said, "ledgers burn, but ashes talk if you listen." Jonah nodded and holstered the ache in his chest. A coyote cut the quiet with a thin cry. Eli said, "Where do we start?" Hank pointed, and hope felt like a blade. By noon the notice board wore a new skin of lies. A wanted sheet snarled Jonah's name with a bounty fat enough to wake wolves. Cole hammered it high, eyes cold and young. Cole said, "Law keeps the streets clean." Jonah said, "Then why does it smell like smoke?" Lila crossed the square with her gaze like a blade. Lila said, "Paper stains can be washed, but not hands." Boone watched from a balcony, sipping calm from a glass. He raised it like a sermon, and the crowd parted. Eli said, "They cheer because they are hungry." Jonah said, "They cheer because they are afraid." A dust devil climbed the board and ate its edge. "Hank," said Storms, picking its side. The saloon breathed, sawdust and regret, when Lila found Jonah. Piano keys slept under a dusty sheet. Lila said, "You stand in a river and call it rain." Jonah said, "Show me the source." She set a brass key on the bar and did not blink. Lila said, "There is a box under the freight office floor." Jonah said, "Boone's teeth are in that lock." Lila said, "He is missing one." Outside spurs passed like a metronome of threat. Jonah touched the key and felt his pulse argue. He said, "If you lie, I drown." Lila said, "If I lie, I drown first." Glass whispered as it settled, and the room held its breath. The freight office creaked under Jonah's boots as he pried the floorboards. Dust lifted like ghosts and shadows leaned long in the lamplight. Eli whispered, "What if it's empty?" Jonah said, "Then Boone keeps his lies close." Wood groaned as iron kissed the air. A steel box sat waiting, black as a coffin. Jonah's hand trembled before resting on the brass key. Lila watched from the door, her face unreadable. She said, "You open that and everything changes." Jonah said, "It already did the day I came back." Eli stepped forward, his hunger sharper than fear. A whistle from the street froze them stiff. Hank's voice drifted in, warning that the night was not theirs to hold. The box lock clicked open with the sound of a pistol's hammer. Inside lay ledgers inked with blood and names written like gravestones. Jonah flipped pages, eyes narrowing. Jonah said, "He bought every soul in this town." Eli said, "And sold yours." Jonah's jaw hardened. Lila touched a page, her hand shaking, and said, "My father's name is here." Jonah looked at her, suspicion heavy as stone. From the street came the crunch of boots and Boone's laughter. Hank hissed, "Shut it, and hide." Jonah said, "Truth doesn't hide. Not anymore." The ledgers burned holes in the dark, a weight heavier than any gun. Morning broke harsh and dry as Jonah and Hank rode out past the mesa. The horizon stretched wide, empty but for vultures. Hank said, "You carry more than bullets now." Jonah said, "Then I carry enough to break him." Eli trailed behind, dust in his teeth, voice hardening. "We take it to the judge." Hank spat, "Judge feeds from Boone's plate." Jonah said, "Then we break the plate." The land around them felt like judgment, raw and endless. A lone church bell carried from town. Hank said, "A reckoning cuts both ways." Jonah tightened reins, his gaze set on smoke curling far off. The saloon filled with whispers as Jonah walked in carrying the ledger. Glasses paused midair, music strangled silent. Boone's deputy Cole leaned from the bar, hand hovering near his holster. Cole said, "Paper won't save you." Jonah said, "It'll hang you." Lila stepped between them, eyes flashing. She said, "Men kill for less than words." Boone's shadow darkened the doorway, his smile slow and cruel. He said, "You always did love theater, Reed." Jonah said, "This stage ends with a rope." Silence cracked into murmurs as townsfolk shuffled away. Eli's hand twitched near his belt knife, eyes locked on Cole. The saloon floor groaned like it expected blood. By night, Jonah sat with Hank by the fire outside town. Sparks climbed into the black like prayers. Hank said, "Ledger's a blade, but blades cut both hands." Jonah said, "Better to bleed than rot." Eli crouched close, young eyes reflecting flame. Eli said, "If this town sees truth, it'll follow." Hank shook his head. "They follow fear." Jonah said, "Then I'll teach them to fear the right man." Silence pressed heavy, broken by coyotes howling at the ridge. Lila's voice carried soft as smoke from the shadows, "Careful, Jonah, truth burns hotter than fire." He looked at her, eyes torn between trust and doubt. The church steps filled with boots and breath as Jonah lifted the ledger to the sun. Heat glazed the words like varnish on bones. Jonah said, "These names paid fear by the pound." Murmurs crawled through the crowd like ants. Boone said, "A book is a puppet when a liar holds the strings." Cole smiled without warmth and set his palm on his holster. Eli said, "Truth is louder than your badge." Hank said, "Careful, boy. Echoes draw bullets." Lila stepped closer, eyes steady. Lila said, "Read the page with my father." Jonah read, and grief tightened a square. Boone said, "You want justice, Reed, or a riot?" Jonah said, "Both if that is the price." A bell rang once, and the town forgot to breathe. The square burst into shouts as Cole lunged for Eli. Iron kissed leather and the world narrowed to a gasp. Cole said, "By order of the sheriff, you're done." Eli said, "I have done nothing but breathe." Jonah said, "Touch him, and you answer to me." Boone laughed like a door closing. Boone said, "Answer to the law, not a drifter with a book." Lila said, "Stop this before blood stains the dust." Hank said, "Jonah, keep your pistol sleeping." Deputies fanned out, rifles low and eager. Jonah raised empty hands and burned inside. Jonah said, "Take me and let the boy go." Cole gripped Eli anyway, and fear picked sides. Bars bit the light into squares as Jonah took the cell meant for Eli. The jail smelled of old smoke and cheap soap. Eli said, "I should be in there." Jonah said, "You should be faster next time." Boone drifted close, voice warm as tar. Boone said, "A hero who trades places is a gift." Hank said, "Gifts can explode." Cole rattled keys and watched for weakness. Lila slipped a folded scrap through the slot. Lila said, "Wagon transfer at dawn." Jonah said, "You keep saving me, I start to worry." Lila said, "Worry later, breathe now." Boone smiled thin and left the room colder than iron. Behind the jail, wind combed the alley with cold fingers. Hank studied the back window and measured risk. Hank said, 3 boards, 1 hinge, and a prayer. Eli said, "I will climb, you cover." Lila stepped from the dark with a flask and steel in her eyes. Lila said, "The wagon leaves by the river road." Hank said, "Why help us when the sheriff owns tomorrow?" Lila said, "Because my yesterday belongs to a grave." Eli said, "We will owe you." Lila said, "Just live long enough to pay." A horse stamped and silence cracked again. Hank said, "When the bell rings twice, we cut." The alley held its breath like a punished choir. Dawn split the horizon as the prison wagon rolled toward the river road. Chains clinked like thin laughter. Boone rode behind, eyes winter hard. Hank said, "Bell, to cut." The church answered, and rifles spoke from the sage. Eli cut the led horse and the wagon slewed. Jonah said, "Down," and the guard hit wood. Cole fired wide and swallowed surprise. Cole said, "Stand down or I drop the boy." Hank stepped into sight and took a bullet through the coat. Lila screamed, and the echo broke stones. Jonah smashed the shackle pin and dove from the wagon. "Boone," said Byrne, "the ledger and the rest can drown." Smoke rose and the morning soured. The church bell tolled again as Jonah dragged Hank behind broken stone. Hank's blood ran dark, soaking the dust. Hank said, "Do not waste breath on me." Jonah said, "You taught me to fight, not to quit." Eli pressed cloth against the wound, his hands trembling. Eli said, "We cannot hold him if Hank falls." Lila crouched close, voice sharp as glass. Lila said, "Boone hunts you with law and lead. He will not stop until you choke." Hank groaned, clutching Jonah's arm. "Hank," said, "the ledger is the rope. Do not let it burn." Jonah's jaw locked, rage sealing his grief. Jonah said, "He will pay for every page." The church bell faded into silence. By mid-morning the square turned into a noose. Boone nailed Jonah's wanted poster over the church door, his voice rolling like thunder. Boone said, "This outlaw bleeds our town with lies." Townsfolk shifted, eyes caught between fear and faith. Cole shouted, "One bounty, and you feed your families." Eli whispered to Jonah, "They will trade you for bread." Jonah said, "Then I starve before I bow." Lila slipped near him, whispering, "Every lie leaves a crack, widen it." Boone raised his glass high, sunlight flashing from its rim. Boone said, "He is no savior, he is a plague." Jonah clenched his fists, knowing war had chosen its ground. Night covered Drywater as Jonah and Eli slipped through the freight yard. Lanterns swayed, their glow soft against coal smoke. Eli said, "If we take the ledgers, Boone has no chains." Jonah said, "Boone's chains are the people." A guard turned, boots heavy on planks. Jonah pulled Eli into shadow, revolver drawn but breath held. Lila's voice whispered from above, "Third car, locked with brass." Jonah looked up, her silhouette sharp against moonlight. Jonah said, "Why risk yourself again?" Lila said, "Because every time I choose Boone, I lose myself." The guard's lantern swung close. Jonah said, "Stay low. One wrong breath, and the dark will eat us." The freight car groaned open, and truth stared back. Stacks of coins, papers, and pistols lay heavy. Eli said, "He owns the whole town with this box." Jonah rifled pages, jaw tightening. Jonah said, "And he wrote his sins in ink." Lila touched a ledger, her voice a crack in the dark. Lila said, "My name was the price for survival." Jonah met her eyes and saw the wound she hid. The guard shouted, and steel flashed. Jonah fired once, silence folding after the shot. Eli gasped, "We cannot carry all of it." Jonah said. We carry the truth, not the gold. The train tracks echoed like a drum beat of war. Dawn broke red as Boone found the freight yard smoking. Jonah stood atop the car, ledger raised like scripture. Jonah said, every name. Here's a debt you will pay. Boone said, you speak like a preacher, but bleed like a thief. Eli shouted, we have proof now. Boone drew his revolver slow, smile carved from stone. Lila stepped between them, her eyes fierce. Lila said, end this before the town burns to ash. Boone said, ash is all it ever was. Jonah cocked his pistol, voice sharp. Jonah said, then let's see who burns first. The sun climbed higher, casting fire across steel, and the world tilted toward blood. The sun burned white above the town square as Jonah faced Boone across 20 paces of dust. The ledger rested at Jonah's boots, heavy as judgment. Boone said, one draw ends this story. Jonah said, this story ends with the truth, not your gun. Eli whispered from the porch, you cannot outshoot him. Jonah said, then I outlive him. Hank leaned on the post, pale but steady. Hank said, remember, he cheats first. Boone's grin widened as he brushed dust from his coat. Lila stood near Jonah, her voice trembling but firm. Lila said, if you fall, so does hope. Jonah's hand hovered, eyes hard as iron, as the square drowned in silence. Boone's hand twitched first, silver flashing in the blaze. Jonah's revolver cleared leather in a single heartbeat. Shots cracked like lightning, dust leaping where lead struck. Eli shouted, down! Hank's cane rifle thundered once, scattering Boone's deputies from the edges. Boone's bullet tore Jonah's sleeve but missed flesh. Jonah fired back, grazing Boone's coat, the crowd screaming as glass shattered. Boone said, you are slower than the lies you tell. Jonah steadied, breath shallow but certain. Jonah said, I only need to be faster once. Lila clutched the ledger, holding it high like a torch. Boone's eyes flicked toward her, and fate slipped a notch. Smoke thickened as Boone advanced, revolver steady. Boone said, you have nothing without me. Jonah stepped forward, eyes never leaving Boone's. Jonah said, I have their names, and that's enough. The crowd hushed, watching two lives pull the world taut. Eli cried, Jonah! As Boone fired again, the bullet ripping splinters from a post. Hank groaned, clutching his wound but still aiming. Lila screamed, end this, Jonah! Boone said, truth dies with you. Jonah fired, the shot cracking Boone's badge, spinning it free. The crowd gasped as the symbol of law hit the dirt, gleaming like a fallen crown. Boone's smile faltered, rage twisting through his face. Boone staggered, blood staining his shirt, but his hand did not fall. Boone said, this town belongs to me. Jonah said, not anymore. Boone fired wild, striking the ground near Eli, sending the boy sprawling. Hank shouted, now Jonah! Jonah's revolver barked again, the bullet slamming Boone back against the post. Boone's eyes burned even as he fell, muttering, only the strong survive. Jonah stood over him, voice low but cutting. Jonah said, then strength is telling the truth. Boone's revolver dropped from his fingers, the echo fading into silence. The crowd gathered, eyes wide, the spell of fear finally broken. The square lay hushed, broken only by boots, shifting and breath catching. Jonah dropped his revolver into the dust, lifting the ledger for all to see. Jonah said, this book holds the price of every soul he bought. Eli stood beside him, voice cracking but strong. Eli said, no more chains. Lila's eyes glistened as she said, the truth is free now. Hank, weak but unbowed, leaned forward. Hank said, let them choose if they want justice. The crowd pressed in, silent, then a murmur grew into a roar. Jonah said, Boone is gone. The rest is in your hands. The square answered, not with fear, but with thunderous voices of its people. The day after Boone fell, silence stretched across Drywater like a blanket too heavy to lift. Jonah sat on the steps of the saloon, ledger beside him, revolver left forgotten in the dust. Eli said, "They look at you different now." Jonah said, "They should look at themselves." Hank leaned in the doorway, pale but upright, cane rifle cradled like a relic. "Hank," said, "fear dies hard, but it dies." Lila stepped into the light, her eyes softer than the night before. Lila said, "What you started can't be finished with one bullet." Jonah nodded, voice low. Jonah said, "Then I'll see it through with the truth." Inside the church, pews groaned as townsfolk filled them for the first time in years. Jonah stood at the front, ledger open like a Bible. Jonah said, "These pages tell how Boone bought silence." Murmurs rippled like water breaking stone. Eli whispered, "They're listening." Lila said, "They want to believe." Hank spoke from the side, voice cracked but firm. Hank said, "Truth is not free, but it's worth paying." Jonah looked at the crowd, seeing both fear and hope braided together. Jonah said, "You decide if this book ends in fire or justice." The people leaned forward, waiting for the weight of their choice. That evening, Jonah and Eli stood by Hank's side as the old man sat near the fire. Hank's face was pale, lined deeper than the canyon walls. Hank said, "I was wrong to think the gun was the only way." Jonah said, "You showed me there's more." Eli leaned closer, whispering, "You cannot leave us now." Hank smiled weakly, hand resting on Jonah's shoulder. Hank said, "I will not see the end, but I know you will carry it." Lila appeared at the doorway, quiet as smoke, eyes glistening. Lila said, "Heroes die, but legends keep walking." Jonah lowered his head, whispering, "Rest now, old man." The next dawn, Hank's chair sat empty, the fire cold. Jonah carried the cane rifle through the quiet street, its weight heavier than steel. Eli said, "He would have wanted you to keep it." Jonah said, "He would have wanted me to put it down." Lila walked beside them, her hand brushing Jonah's arm. Lila said, "You cannot walk away from what you've built." Jonah said, "I can walk away from blood." The town stirred, watching him like a man reborn and burdened. Jonah stopped at the square and set the rifle at the foot of Boone's broken post. Jonah said, "The dead rest, the living rise." At dusk, the townsfolk gathered again as Jonah placed the ledger into the church's altar box. Jonah said, "This belongs to you now. Guard it, learn from it, never forget." Eli said, "The fear is gone." Jonah looked at him, voice steady. Jonah said, "Fear never leaves, but courage answers louder." Lila whispered, "And what of you, Jonah?" He said, "I will go where the road carries me." Silence pressed until Hank's empty chair was carried in and set at the front, facing the people. The crowd bowed heads, tears mixing with pride. Jonah stepped outside into the fading light, a shadow already leaving the town behind. The road stretched endless as Jonah saddled his horse at dawn, the sky painted in bruised pink and gold. Drywater still slept, though its silence was different now, lighter, like chains removed. Eli walked up, shoulders squared, a boy no longer. Eli said, "You'll leave them without a guard." Jonah fastened his saddle, eyes never leaving the horizon. Jonah said, "They have each other now. That's stronger than a gun." Lila stepped out from the saloon porch, shawl wrapped tight against the chill. She said, "And what about you, Jonah? Where will you go?" He said, "Where the road still remembers me." The morning air carried a whisper of promise and loss. The townsfolk gathered quietly near the square, watching without words as Jonah led his horse forward. Children peeked from behind mothers' skirts, eyes wide at the man who had broken Boone's hold. Jonah paused at Boone's broken post, staring at the scarred wood where law had been twisted into fear. He placed Hank's cane rifle across it, the gesture heavy as stone. Jonah said, "He stood so you could rise, don't forget that." An old woman whispered, "We will remember." Eli looked at Jonah, voice cracked. Eli said, "Will I see you again?" Jonah met his eyes, steady. Jonah said, "If the wind carries me back." The crowd lowered heads in silent oath. At the church, Jonah stepped inside one last time, lantern glow spilling across pews. The ledger lay sealed in the altar box, guarded by townsfolk, chosen to keep it. Jonah traced the wood with a calloused hand, his voice a whisper meant only for himself. Jonah said, "The past doesn't vanish, but it doesn't have to own tomorrow." Eli's footsteps echoed behind him. Eli said, "You gave them something worth holding." Jonah said, "No, I just reminded them it was theirs all along." Lila entered, her eyes shimmering. Lila said, "And what about you? Do you ever find peace?" Jonah smiled faintly, a scarred man's smile. Jonah said, "Peace is a stranger, but I'll ride beside him a while." Outside the town's edge, Jonah mounted his horse, the saddle creaking beneath him like an old friend. The sky had turned to blazing gold, the desert stretching wide and endless. Lila stood at the fence, her shawl fluttering with the wind. Lila said, "You could stay. They would follow you." Jonah looked at her, silence speaking longer than words. Jonah said, "If I stay, I carry their shadows. If I leave, maybe they'll carry the light." Eli rushed forward, gripping Jonah's boot. Eli said, "I'll be ready when you return." Jonah nodded, voice steady. Jonah said, "Don't wait for me. Lead them better than I ever could." He tugged the reins, horse pawing the dust. Jonah rode slowly through the desert road, his shadow stretching long behind him. The sound of hooves echoed like a heartbeat, fading into the wild silence. He said softly to himself, "Every man leaves dust, but not every man leaves echoes." Behind him, Drywater stirred with new voices, children laughing, hammers building, hope rising like morning sun. Lila stood at the edge, watching until he vanished, tears tracing her cheeks, her lips whispering, "Ride safe, Jonah." Eli's figure stood tall beside her, already carrying tomorrow in his shoulders. The horizon swallowed Jonah Reed whole, his silhouette fading into legend, carried on wind and memory.